All right, we are live at Myth Vision Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about John the Baptist. We're going to deal with Jesus. What can we know? What can we understand in particular, historically, maybe? Gleaning this literature and surrounding literature we call the New Testament and outside on understanding this. And I have a special guest. But before we do get to our special guest, I'm going to let you guys know that not only is John the Baptist and Jesus worthy, but so is Myth Vision. You're an eyewitness. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Myth Vision, and today I have a special guest, and it's going to be James Frank McGrath, and he is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University, and is known for his work on early Christianity, Mandeism, criticism of the Christ myth theory. We're going to have to get into all of this. We're going to have to do this. And the analysis of religion in science fiction. He received his PhD from Durham University in 1998. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a special shout out to Dr. James F. McGrath. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Everybody give a round of applause. I seriously appreciate the episode we already did, which is on the Patreon. But before we get started, I need everybody to know in the description, you can go to his pathos.com blog to see what he has written. He stays up to speed and is constantly writing here. So if you want to see what he says, is this also where you're critical of the Christ myth theory?
There's some content going back, I think, more than a decade now. So yeah, I've been commenting on that topic for quite some time.
Excellent. Go check out the blog. Can they subscribe to it or?
Yep.
Excellent.
There's a little box on the side, I think. Just stick in your email address and they will let you know when there's something new on there.
Excellent. I need to do that myself because somehow I forget to do that whenever I have my guest on. But you also have many books, and we're going to be diving into some of these books as time goes by. Today, we're going to be really dealing with John the Baptist, but that kind of automatically connects us to Jesus and what's going on. And I've had a patron of mine, speaking of which, I might as well shamelessly plug. I did share this to my Patreon, letting everybody know we're going live. And one of my patrons actually wrote me in a private message and said, Derek, you really need to get Dr. McGrath to come on and deal with Mandeanism. Like, you have dealt with this very deeply, I guess. Did you want to comment on that?
Sure. And I expect we'll go into at least a little bit more detail as we talk about John the Baptist. But the Mandaeans are the last surviving Gnostic group to have existed sort of continuously from ancient times down to the present day. And they're just fascinating for that reason alone, right? I mean, think how excited everybody got when they found the Nag Hammadi texts in Egypt, right? Those Coptic texts with all those sources that are categorized as Gnostic. And of course, there's debate among scholars about whether that's a helpful term or not. But there's, if you want to call it the religion formerly known as Gnosticism or something like that, feel free. Anyway, but as shorthand, I think I'll continue to use it just because otherwise, we'll be squeezing out other stuff we could talk about in order to add those qualifiers all the time. But anyway, this group is that tradition, right? They have beliefs that are very similar, sometimes the same as the kinds of things that we found in those texts, and they're a living tradition. And it's ridiculous that they aren't better known than they are, because you think about how much attention has been given to Gnosticism, right? Whether in serious form, right? The popularity of Elaine Pagels's books and things like that, documentaries, things of that sort. You think about how popular culture has woven in things, Dan Brown and others, influence, to mention science fiction, Philip K. Dick, very influenced by Valentinianism and things of that sort. And we have this living tradition, right? And we live in a time when you don't have to go and just read books, right? You can go on YouTube and not just learn about them in some convenient little snippet, but you can actually see their religious practices. And the reason why I think we will end up talking about them more than once today, and I think they're a good place to start today's topic, is that they hold John the Baptist in really high esteem, right? They view him as a member of their religious tradition, as a proponent of their central ritual, which is baptism. And you can get on YouTube and see Mandaean baptism, right? Just type that in and a whole bunch of videos will pop up. And one thing that makes them particularly fascinating, even within Gnosticism, is that there's something unique about them, which is they like John the Baptist, and that's true of a number of Gnostic traditions. They're not fans of Jesus. And that's unusual, right? And so that's at times led scholars to at least consider the possibility that they might have some connection with followers of John the Baptist who held John in high esteem, but weren't persuaded that this Jesus guy is John's successor, never mind maybe something even bigger than that.
We're going to unravel this, I think, as our episode continues. And the audience is more than welcome to super chat your questions, and we will address them. I will present them to Dr. McGrath. Criticisms, questions, comments, thanks, all that fun stuff is obviously welcome. And you can earn your salvation that way, too. I forgot to mention that's important, too. But I also want to do a quick plug and just mention that Dr. Bart Ehrman is actually doing a course, for those who aren't aware, on the Gospels. You won't want to miss it. Just got done talking to him, actually, with Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic. Hint, hint, he's going to be doing a video again soon as well. So be on the lookout. Go sign up, mythvisionpodcast.com/unknown gospels. Get it now while it's early bird special, so everybody can get a deep dive into understanding Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, how scholars read the Gospels, because most people aren't even reading them the way academics do. So there's my little shameless plug. Dr. McGrath, from what I understand, and I do not know a lot of material when it comes to John the Baptist, but I know that the Gospels mention this guy. Paul doesn't mention him for whatever reason. Maybe it's just occasional letters, so it's not really a valuable point to him. And maybe there was competition by the time Paul's writing this between both sects, and he's not having it. But the Gospels mention him. Josephus mentions John the Baptist in this like short little sweet boom and I'm gone kind of thing. Is there any other literature that really helps us glean better understanding of John?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of interesting stuff. How much, if any of it, has any historical value is a question. I mean, there's question whether the Gospels are to be trusted when it comes to John the Baptist. But the very extent to which they increasingly are bending over backwards to downplay John, to say John is subordinate to Jesus, have John himself emphasize this, is precisely the kind of thing that leads historians to think, there was a real John. He was famous, maybe in his time more famous than Jesus, and the Gospels are trying, to counter what is a prevailing view, at least in some circles, that John is the one that you should pay attention to, if anyone. In fact, we'll probably get to the fact that Jesus himself seems to have held that viewpoint. But as far as texts go, I mean, one that I'll mention is the Mandaean sources themselves. They have a range of things from a version of an infancy story with some of the same characters, right, Zechariah and Elizabeth, and yet a very different sort of unfolding. They have accounts of John's preaching, often with a Gnostic slant. The Mandaean Book of John, which I, together with Charles Heberl of Rutgers University, we were involved in producing the first full-fledged critical edition, translation, commentary in English. And yeah, the reason it's called the Book of John, it's not a version of the Gospel of John. That's the Book of John the Baptist, and that's one of the names. There's several names for this work, but that's one of the names that it goes by, and particularly in English, it's known by that because it has this central section that's focused on John, his life, his teaching, and they even have a version of John's baptism of Jesus, right? So John baptizing Jesus, but in their version, Jesus comes to John. And John tries to say no, not because John doesn't think he's worthy to baptize Jesus or something like that, but because John doesn't think Jesus is worthy. He thinks he's bad news. He's going to go off the rails. He's going to, twist the religion into something else. And one reason why I think there might be some historical recollection there, going back to followers of John, is first of all the fact that it's the same story yet a very different angle on it. But also the fact that John, in the Mandaean Book of John, accuses Jesus of doing some things sort of against the Jewish law. And it's hard to imagine that coming up as a criticism because Gnostics aren't fans of the Jewish law, right? They view the creator who's responsible for that, the creator in Genesis, as this inferior entity who creates the world and organizes it out of either a misguided or a malevolent motivation. And so for John to criticize Jesus of that, it doesn't seem like something they would invent, sort of once they've got a Gnostic view of things. And so that might suggest that there are traditions embedded in this text that go back to before that time, whenever that was.
This piques my curiosity to follow the conversation further. But for one moment, let's just give a shout out to our audience here. The Uncle Jesus Show, Ray Ashima, welcome. Yes, 3,000 myth points to you, Ray. And, early birds get the worm. Savannah, thank you for the super sticker. We are Myth Vision. Everybody in the chat, welcome.
So say we all.
Huh?
So say we all.
Exactly. Thank you for everybody joining in. Ooh, Dr. James D. Tabor joined us. So great to see you, James. Love you are doing this topic so dear to my heart. I really appreciate that, James, for showing up. Jason, Lord of the Four Corners, Sobek. I got your name all backwards. Good to see you. And everybody else in the chat. JS, Carrie, George. I just want to say hey to everybody. Psychological Shackle Breakers. Good to see you. Good to see you. Deb on the Facebook side. Ricky Johnson, who's a member. Good to see you. Sherry, Emmy, Savannah, JV, Johnny, Mark. There's all sorts of people. Anyway, I just want to say, hey, welcome in the chat. Thank you for tuning in. Yes, you did get your salvation, my friend. You are saved.
Do you save? Speaking of salvation, do you save this chat somewhere? Because it looked like there was, some interesting stuff going by too quick for me to read, and I'm like,
yes,
yeah. But somebody had a question about, is there an academic edition of something or other? And it was like, God, before I even. So.
Yeah, there's definitely the chat is saved for after the episode. So if you ever go back and watch, you can read that. As far as anyone who wants to drop a comment or question, whatever, they'll super chat their question in. We'll take those. But I wanted to follow up on this Mandaean thing because I wanted to give you, I am not educated in this area at all. I'm just coming at this, and I kind of wonder. A lot of academics think the Gospels have, or even Jesus has been influenced in his own mouth by Paul's ideas. So when we talk about Jesus being against something Torah-like, how do we know that that would be Jesus and not Paul shining through, because his gospel is a Gentile gospel, which would be, if we take Paula Fredrickson, if we go with some of the Ingsberg, Peterson, Trolls, Ingsberg, Peterson, these ideas that Paul's audience would have been people he didn't want to go towards Torah. So when Jesus is saying these things, isn't it more likely that he would have said these things because he was influenced by Pauline theology, whoever the author was? Or are we saying that Jesus himself was this really liberal type of rabbi like Hillel who might have said some things that ruffled the feathers of other Jews? Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should probably connect it with one of the things that some people, if they were scrolling through that list of books of mine that you put up there earlier, may have noticed, which is that there isn't one on John the Baptist. That's because this coming year I'm on sabbatical, and so this is actually something that I've begun working on, but will be devoting the whole of this coming year to, right? So this is like my big project. And it really is an opportunity to take the Mandaean stuff that I did and the historical Jesus stuff that I did and bring them back together so that I focus on John the Baptist. But yeah, certainly the Mandaean texts don't just criticize Jesus for things that are historically plausible as things Jesus said and did. They criticize him for sort of monasticism and celibacy and, you know, other things that I think maybe later developments, although how much later, yeah, it's hard to tell. There have been different views. Certainly, there are some strands of Christian thought that seem to go in that direction fairly early. Yeah, the Mandaeans are not ascetics, you know, sort of rejecting sex and things like that. You know, they view family life quite positively, given that they're Gnostics, you know, who often have a very negative view of the world. That's, you know, another striking feature. But I'm not suggesting that, you know, the Mandaeans necessarily have John's actual criticism of Jesus here. But it may be that, you know, Jewish followers of John who understood him in some particular way that eventually became part of Mandaism may have been criticizing Christianity and Jesus along with it for things that may have owed more to Paul, right? But they may have associated with Jesus because Paul and his views were what they associated with Jesus by that stage, right? So how far back any of this goes is, I mean, it's not something we're going to be able to determine with any degree of certainty, but there has, yeah. One reason why I'm so frustrated by the relative neglect of the Mandaeans is that if these were New Testament texts, people would have gone over them with a fine-tooth comb, and countless different possible interpretations and ways of parsing the evidence would have been suggested and argued about. And at this point, you know, there hasn't been that kind of careful, detailed study of this, you know, counter-suggestion, you know, response, you know, saying, no, that argument won't work because. And so even though we've known about these texts for longer than we've known about the Nag Hammadi texts, this level of work, this level of attention has not been paid to them. And they deserve that attention. I mean, they really are that fascinating.
I'm fascinated with it, especially when I've recently been interviewing with Dr. James D. Tabor, who's talking about John the Baptist. And you also saw those interviews and you were like, you know what?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I can, you know, add some, you know, ideas into what James is saying. Let me paint a fast picture because this is a show I really want to roll the red carpet out for you on this. This first live stream. In fact, this is the first show you've been presented on Myth Vision to the general public. The other one is hidden away on Myth Vision's Patreon for those who want to help support us. I will get to your super chats. I seriously appreciate those comments, super chats, questions, whatever. But when I was a fundamentalist Christian, Jesus was God in the flesh. The Bible was practically worship the Bible. You know, there's no errors. Everything's perfect and infallible and all of that. But then I started to doubt. I had issues that started coming up. I started actually asking serious, sincere questions. And I went to the full, total other side of things where nothing's historical. Jesus might even be a solar myth. And you know, there's nothing historical at all in the whole 9 yards. And when I went to that side, I was like, I was excited to find out what wasn't historically reliable. Then I started backpedaling. I saw a bone metaphorically sticking out of the ground. I was like, hold on, that looks like a fossil. Like there seems to be some historical basis for some of this. And it was gentlemen like James D. Tabor who really made me go, hold on, this has some really Jewish root to it. It sounds like this is historically, there's something to this. And so in what way would you say Jesus is historical and John the Baptist is historical? Can you paint the setting at least for these two gentlemen?
Yeah. And yeah, I hope we'll do another one of these once the book is done, where I can say, yeah. So at that point, I was thinking this, but now, yeah. But this is an era in which you have what we might call apocalyptic fervor for a number of reasons, right? There was a short-lived bit of, Jewish independence beyond what they'd had really throughout most of their history. They still were, relating to larger powers in the region, but the Hasmoneans had sort of really carved out something like a kingdom there, and they were fascinating figures, right? They united the role of high priest and king into one, right? And those are themes that come up in Christianity. But one of the things that James Tabor talks about that I'll be exploring as I work on this project is, did John see himself as the sort of priestly Messiah, right? Who then presumably would, the priestly anointed one, restoring the high priesthood, and then would be presumably the one, like the high priests back in the Israelite monarchy, to anoint the royal Messiah when he came, right? And so that would make a fair amount of sense, right, of some of the configuration that we see. And it may be that if John spoke about someone who's coming after him, who is going to be, possibly even greater than himself, that it might be that figure. We'll want to come back to that, because just as Jesus speaks in a way about this coming Son of Man, and people are like, well, something sounds like he's talking about someone else, but isn't he talking about himself? I think that John's followers may have wondered as well, is John talking about somebody else, or is John really talking about himself? But when it comes to the question of historicity, as you trace these trajectories back, you start peeling off layers, you go back to the earliest sources and give them a certain amount of priority, you contextualize them in the Judaism of their time, and you find that the earliest stuff makes good sense, better sense, in that context. Right? And to the extent that as it goes on, it seems universalized and starts to resemble, people say it looks more and more like, just another mystery cult or Eastern religion that's being imported to Rome and other places. It makes much more sense as a phenomenon within Judaism, right? There isn't a later point when a sort of a purely celestial figure then picks up a debate about Korban and the niceties of the Jewish law and how vows relate to honoring your parents and all these kinds of details that are showing up in there. And so clearly, John and Jesus are teachers in that context, but they seem to be more than that. And I think that one thing that gets lost, and this is again something that James Tabor emphasizes as well, is that John was known as the baptizer, the immerser. And so clearly that's something that stood out. And he was not just doing the same kind of purity immersion that everybody was doing. If he was, then that nickname would have not made him stand out. You don't call somebody, Derek the atheist when everyone, most people are atheists, right, or something like that. Right? If you're in a church, then you might be introduced as, here's Derek the atheist, or something like that, right? Because you kind of are standing out that way.
Right. I don't want to be named that, though.
No. Yeah.
Even if I am one, it's like, please don't title me that.
Plus, so. But if everyone is Myth Vision, then that nickname is not going to make you stand out. And so the fact that John is the immerser in a context in which people were immersing themselves left, right, and center, from Greek and Roman bathing to purity immersions, suggests that he's doing something different. And Jesus, whatever he becomes and however he comes to understand himself, we first encounter him as part of that movement of John. And John's movement, I think, one reason why I want to do this book, and think it's a book that will be interesting. In fact, I'm hoping to write 2 books, one with all the detailed academic stuff that my colleagues in academia will want, but also I want to do a biography of John the Baptist for a general audience, right? That takes some of the stuff and distills it, but also connects the dots and paints the big picture. And I think that most people have paid insufficient attention to John because they're only interested in what they can find out about Jesus by looking at John. And one of the things I'm going to do that's a little bit different in my book or my research project on this is to realize that if Jesus was John's follower, he was part of his movement initially, then we can look at Jesus to find out stuff about John, right? Some of the broad overview, some of the details will reflect John's influence. And I think that once we do pay attention to John, maybe bringing Jesus into the picture, but switching which one we're focusing on and which one is serving us in trying to bring that other figure into clearer focus. I think that those who are mostly interested in Jesus will actually get a different understanding and maybe a deeper understanding of him as somebody who was, was a baptizer, right? Who was involved in this movement and got his start within those circles before becoming anything that was independent of that.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to take a few of these super chats, which they come up on the screen, so you'll be able to see them nice and clear in color. And if they don't address some of the questions, I like to share, because I could ask these questions and they're like, I already super chat that question. Whatever they miss, I'll try and fill in the cracks in terms of what I would think would be an interesting question to have your responses to. First one's by Apollo's Christian Apologetics. Thank you for the super chat. Historically, I think John didn't realize who's coming after him, even while baptizing, while Jesus believed in his exalted status after. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that John may at some point have thought Jesus might be the one. There's that famous story in the Gospels about John sending word saying, are you the one who's to come, or should we be expecting someone else? And that both entertains the possibility, but also at least entertains doubt, maybe serious doubt. And so Jesus may have been sort of poised at some point to be like John's natural successor, or have been sort of John's right-hand man, as it were, or something like that. But John did not single him out the way the Gospels depict, right? John is talking about one who is to come. And one thing that's interesting is that, in Aramaic, if you want to say someone, a person, a human being, the expression used is son of man, right? Bar Nasha is the way you say that in Aramaic. And so there may be continuity between John's way of speaking and some of the sayings attributed to Jesus in those son of man sayings, right? Jesus may have been continuing to speak in that way. And with that same sense of, okay, so is Jesus just sort of speaking on John's behalf, talking about one who's to come, or is he now identifying himself with that figure? And so, yeah, I think that John probably did talk in those terms. And one interesting possibility that I'm hoping to explore further, during the first century, sort of after this time, there's this succession of figures, right? And there's some, close to this time, there's some a little later, who get mentioned by Josephus in particular, right? They sometimes are stuck under the heading of sign prophets. And they each promise that God will do some sort of sign, and they expect that deliverance will follow. And one possibility that I don't think anybody suggested yet is that maybe these are other people who were part of John's movement who thought, okay, well, it wasn't that Jesus guy because he ended up crucified. Maybe it'll be me, and maybe I can be the one. And John isn't here now to lend his support to this, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and expect the Jordan to part, or expect the Mount of Olives to split, or expect something amazing to happen. And I wonder if a number of figures, not just Jesus, were influenced by what John said about one who is to come after him.
Yeah, I've been typing a couple questions that you've given me ideas about. So, thank you for that response. Yoni Spinoza, Johnny, Friend of the Bridegroom by Sergius Bulgakov is a masterpiece and comprehensive. Okay. You must have it, or you don't have that one.
I'm gonna see. I don't remember Bulgakov being sort of a kind of the historical critical type of approach that I'm trying to include everything, including John's influence, because there's some influence on Islam, right? Mm-hmm. We don't actually have any clear instance of a Jewish proselyte baptism until after this time, right? I mean, so it could have been an influence on John, but it could also be something that developed in Judaism as a result of some of the things that John was doing, and in not embracing what John was doing, but maybe responding to it. And so there are lots of questions, but I do want to look at some of the there are sometimes things even in more theologically oriented works So I will take a look and see what's in there. And one of the things I'm very much trying to do, and so we'll mention this in case anybody has suggestions. Have got a pretty good bibliography of what's there in English, German, and French. Have been trying to include Italian and Spanish and other languages, but there's some where I don't even not even that proficient with the script, but might be able to get it and get some help. And so if there are things, say in Russian or Ukrainian or Bulgarian or other languages, recommendations are always welcome.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Spinoza. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners. Thank you. Is it fallacy to see a community behind each text, i.e. a Johannine? If the Gospels as, what is this?
Bio, yeah. So like Greco-Roman biographies.
Got it. Aren't they closer to Lucian or Achilles Tatius or Tatius? Sorry.
Yeah. So there's been some debate about whether the Gospels are written for communities or whether they were written so the way you'd write a book today, and you hope everyone's going to read it, right? I think that the truth is that there are all kinds of books. There's some that you hope will be bestsellers and will be accessible to everyone, and there's some that are really targeted at some particular audience and aren't going to make sense outside of those circles, but might sell 1 million copies in those circles, right? And so I think authors, ancient and modern, can range across that spectrum. The fact that we see influence of one gospel on another shows that they're circulating texts. The fact that they're not just reading those texts, but writing new editions, adding to them, supplementing them, suggests that they felt that there were particular needs to be met in some place or in some context or some time period that were better met by a different take on the story. And so I think there's a need for both perspectives, and it's really, for me, much more a question of which predominates, right? Is this much more, something that's happening over in a corner, a bit more isolated, or is it somebody writing hoping that everybody's going to read this?
Right. Thank you so much for that. S. Duck says Josephus, Theudas sure sounds like John the Baptist. I'm not sure how common decapitation was used in the first century. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've never done the statistics, like say decapitation as opposed to crucifixion. Both are very common, and so seem to happen fairly often. And that's one of the reasons why I was sort of critiquing sort of Richard Carrier's effort to say Jesus is less likely to be historical because he has these things in common with this and this figure, and some of those are so vague. It's like born into royalty. It's like, yeah, it happens to lots of historical figures too, right? In fact, one of the interesting questions is, how many people would have actually been descended from David in this period, and probably could have like ramped that up and tried to make something of themselves on that basis if they'd tried to, right? Jesus is not able to necessarily trace himself, depending on which of the contradictory genealogies you look at in the Gospels, not able to trace himself along the actual reigning line of kings, but sort of a lateral line. So they're
I mean,
fairly common.
Just to give one thing about the whole line thing, there are modern Jews today, rabbis, who claim Davidic line, and there's no way they can prove it. So there's a fictive development of genealogy in their mind that they're connected to a certain line, Davidic or Aaron or whoever. And so even if that were the case in the first century, they're still doing what modern Jews do often, modern rabbis, if you will, who try to tie their genealogy back. So whether they're in reality someone is a true Davidic son, or if it's presented because there's a religious tradition, doesn't matter. People could still be saying, hey, I come from this line, and people actually believed that they come from a certain line, whether it's literally factually true or not. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one exception is that it does seem that even after the destruction of the temple, priests were held in high regard, and there were at least some people who were of priestly tradition, priestly ancestry rather, within Jewish communities and Israelite communities more broadly, were held in a certain high esteem. And so we do have the development of surnames like Cohen, which means priest. And interestingly enough, among the Samaritans, so I visited Samaria for the first time this summer, which was a great experience, and actually had the privilege of being blessed, right? So the Aaronic blessing, right, the high priestly blessing from Numbers, in the Bible, sort of said over me by the Samaritan high priest. And so that's pretty much as authentic an Aaronic blessing as I think anyone can get. So it was quite an honor to meet him, but for him to make the effort to do that. But they have the surname Cohen as well. In fact, his grandson was telling us that he gets all kinds of strange looks because his name is Abud Cohen. So
I interviewed him.
Abdallah, yeah. So it's like Arabic first name and the most Jewish last name possible, right? Because these are Israelites but living in the the West Bank, and so it's a fascinating tradition. But anyway, so there may have been some who kept particularly I think the priestly and sort of Levitical status they were more concerned about that. What's interesting is that messianism, in the sense of restoring the kingship, people think that's got to be like central to Judaism because it's central to Christianity. But Christianity sort of approaches Judaism in that way and sometimes depicts Judaism as focused on this as fulfillment because that's what Christianity is about. But I think that in Jesus' time, there were plenty of people for whom we don't want. We'd rather have a king of our own than direct Roman rule, but we don't mind if it's the Hasmoneans or the Herodians, as long as they are, not overtaxing us and not making life difficult for us, and keeping things the way we want them to be. Right? So I think that there was a lot more focus on Davidic ancestry. And I also have to say, as somebody who's done a bit of family history research, when if you hear stories of nobility and things like that, sometimes you'll find those things. Very often they turn out not to be true, right? And so there are bound to be people who are saying, "Oh yeah, you move to a new area, and it's like, how do we get in good with these people? We don't have really good connections here." Well, we actually have some illustrious ancestors in our background. And people did that in ancient times, and people continued to do that into more recent times.
My dad told me we either have royal blood from a king line or we're vagabonds and thieves. Either one, he said. Just to tease you, I did interview Abud, if you see right here, Abud Cohen, and he was really a sweetheart. I mean, really, really nice gentleman. And he does virtual tours of Mount Gerizim for anyone who is interested. But thank you for that. Abel Sheba says, Quran hadith states that Jesus is coming back with water dripping from his head on wings of two angels, literally still baptized, I think, because all three holy books are what I call anti-parallels.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't. Thank you. Thank you so much, Abel, for the super chat. And he also says Quran states everything came from water. So water baptism may signify or symbolize or to say we are from this world, a water planet, reincarnation.
Interesting. Yeah, certainly I do want to at least, have some reference in the book, talking about sort of the impact of John. Because I really do think in a lot of ways he's perhaps the most significant figure in the history of religion in a lot of ways. When you really trace the ripples of his impact, to use a water metaphor. And so definitely if they're, any hadith, doesn't matter that they are, likely to be authentic or not, right? Hadith are that oral tradition, that sort of get started. So you have the Quran, which is viewed as God's word, and then the hadith are like the oral tradition, stories about Muhammad, things that he's supposed to have said, but said speaking for himself, not, sort of God's word coming through him. And I'm interested in those. So anyone who wants to share ones that are about John the Baptist, directly or indirectly, absolutely, send them my way.
Thank you. Yeah. Here's a question. I thought about this, put this together while you were talking, and we were getting a little deep, and then some things distract us to go here and there. But Judas the Galilean, here is this Jewish man who, I believe it was him and his father, according to Josephus, who go to cleanse the temple. I believe. I could be mistaken, but I know that, I don't know, but I hear that Roman soldiers are coming to squash some type of riots that may have occurred or something. Is there some tradition connected between Judas the Galilean and John the Baptist, do you think?
Uh, yeah, I don't know if there's any direct evidence, but John, I mean, one of the biggest problems with the way he's depicted in film and things like that is that he's depicted as this wild, scraggly guy, wearing, sometimes it's, dressed like a caveman. I've seen it in at least one or two
I
motion
almost
picture,
made that our thumbnail.
right? Yeah, and in fact, I mean, he's got followers as far away as Ephesus, right? You've got the religious leadership, the political leadership paying careful attention to him and concerned about him. I mean, this is an influential guy, right? And his clothing, he styled himself as Elijah, right? Whether metaphorically or thinking he actually did have some kind of celestial connection with Elijah, or that's another question. But he's Elijah is somebody who's challenging kings and bringing about really trying to bring about a revolution, right? I mean, he's not just saying, I don't like what's going on here. He's challenging the authority of the king. He's challenging the worship that's going on. He's doing a lot of those kinds of things. So I'm not sure I have anything very specific to say about Judas the Galilean. I will give that some more thought and come back to that. But one of the things I do want to say, which might lead us back to Judas the Galilean, feel free to bring it back there if it's of interest, right? So looking for John's influence on Jesus in the Gospels. And one of the things that it would be easy to miss is that the Gospel of John places the thing that you called like a cleansing of the temple, right? Jesus driving out the money changers and stuff like that, places it early in the activity of Jesus. So early that according to the Gospel of John, right, this is not just, I mean, this is basically before the Gospel of Mark starts, as it were, almost. I mean, not quite, because, you've got the baptism first, but then Jesus is presumably part of John's movement for a while before all this other stuff happens that's depicted in Mark and the other synoptic Gospels. And so in John's Gospel, John is not in prison yet at this point. And so Jesus is presumably still part of John's movement, or would have been perceived as at least an offshoot, if not actually still part of it. And so when Jesus talks about the temple being destroyed and rebuilt and things of that sort, I think he would have been perceived, and perhaps rightly, as delivering a message from John, right? And so one question is, does that give us some kind of indication of what John the Baptist was about? Because he's and there's a fascinating family background here that I've also been enjoying digging into and speculating about, right? His father's a priest, and John proclaims this baptism for the forgiveness of sins that basically is almost like opening a competing franchise with his father, right? So his father works in the temple offering forgiveness of sins through animal sacrifice there, and John is like, yeah, you can do it through water. It's like, do you not need the temple anymore? Is it just And if Jesus' message to the temple authorities that the temple's days are numbered was a message from John, then that really does help us bring John the Baptist into focus in interesting ways. Because a lot of scholars don't think that what Jesus did was a cleansing of the temple. There may have been issues with where animals were being sold and things like that. But if you can't sell animals and you can't exchange money into appropriate coinage so you can pay temple tax and things like that, then you can't do the thing that the temple is there to do, right? The sacrifice and all the other things. And between that and the prediction of the temple's destruction, a lot of scholars think that the action itself was actually sort of a symbolic action, a portent of its destruction, rather than saying, just get rid of these animals and this place will be fine.
Which makes me want to get into another question after we get this one super chat here. Shikushi, I think I'm saying it correctly. Forgive me if I butchered your name. Greetings from Finland. Can't stick around today, but I've been on Myth Vision binge recently. Definitely going to enjoy listening to this later. Thank you so much for the support. Was John an Essene? Because the Essenes obviously spoke against the really, it seems, and I could be wrong here, that they might have even held to a different calendar, but they were not fans of the priest in the temple. So do you place him in that tradition?
Yeah. At the moment, I'm inclined not to. And this is another one of those things where, after thinking about this for a whole other year, doing very little else, I might, change my mind again. There are scholars who think John may have even spent time at Qumran and things like that. If you visit Qumran, right, in the Holy Land, right, so when you decide to go and get a boot to be your tour guide to show you Samaria, also visit Qumran, right? It's a great site. But they have this video that they show, and it's not like other videos you get at the when you visit sites. There, it shows you a bit of the life of the community, like reconstructed, acted out. And there's this one scene where I was like laughing out loud the first time I was there. Somebody says, we heard that Herod killed this person, John. There was a John who used to be here. It couldn't be the same person, could it? And I'm just like, it's not impossible, but I think that people have sort of overplayed the connections, right? And what the Essenes at Qumran were doing was mostly immersion for purity, because they were unhappy with the way that things were being done in the temple, and couldn't persuade the priests to do things the way they thought they should be done. They stopped participating, and so eventually the water immersions and other things sort of became a kind of a substitute for sacrifice. But we never really get the sense that they're thinking of the temple being sort of destroyed and replaced or done away with, or replaced with another not made of human hands, as the gospel tradition, some variants has it. And so I'm less and less convinced that John was an Essene. Certainly he may have been influenced by them. I think there's a possibility that he may have encountered Samaritans and realized that there are these people who say they're Israelites, and that's the appropriate place to worship, and that they've got the right priesthood and we're doing it wrong. And I think that John at some point encountered a wider array of diverse views, and that sort of forced him into this thing that he does that actually is kind of unique in its own way. Because again, the Essenes don't become known as the Baptists, right? And John doesn't get known as the Essene, either of which would have made sense if he was sort of doing what they were doing, even if he was popularizing it for a wider audience, right? He was at the very least doing that. But I think that at most he was taking something that not just the Essenes but others were doing, but put a very unique spin on it.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Dr. McGrath. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, thoughts on the pseudo-Clementine literature ascribing Simon of Samaria as a follower of John the Baptist. Also, thoughts on some GOJ material reacting to Simon.
Maybe Gospel of John?
I believe it might be. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know Gauge material, but if that's Gospel of John, then they might have an inkling of what it's about. So here's where this really connects with another aspect of this project. There's more than one tradition that connects John the Baptist with sort of the beginnings of Gnosticism, right? And so we have the Mandaeans, who are Gnostics, who hold John the Baptist in high esteem. But we also have Simon Magus, as he's known in Christian tradition, Simon of Samaria, being viewed as sort of the first Gnostic. But he's associated with a teacher who he supplants, according to some tellings of the story, whose name was Dositheus, right? Also in Samaria. And one thing that's really interesting, so on the one hand, the Samaritan literature actually has a sect. They call it the Dostan sect, like it's the way it's put, but we can see behind that Dosithian, right? We can see the kind of the remnants of the name in that. And they were a group that practiced some kind of immersion, and there are hints of things that might associate them with John the Baptist, from the Samaritan sources and things like that. And then there's this Syrian Christian author who's the first one to really quote from Mandaean sources. And he calls the group that these come from, he has a number of names, but one of them is Dosthians, right? So again, it seems to be associating them with those Scythians. And whether he thought, well, they must be this because they're Gnostics and they like John the Baptist, I don't know. I mean, it seems like there may be more to it than that. And so I'm not convinced that John was a Gnostic, right? But clearly the origins of Gnosticism, right, given that we see it being attributed to, it emerges in Christian circles and in circles around John the Baptist. And something is coming together, at least in his entourage or something like that, right? And that's another thing that I'm trying to really figure out here. And I think I've got some of the clues starting to come together, right? So one of the fascinating things that shows up in Mandaean texts is that there are these names of light world figures, so celestial beings, that seem to actually embed like pre-exilic Israelite stuff, right? So you have a light world figure, Anat, right? So Anat and then the name life, right? And Anat, or Anat Yahweh, even we get, right, among the Jews at Elephantine, right? They had this whole other temple that was there for a really long time, which is fascinating, right? So pre-exilic Israelite religion didn't just vanish, right, after the Torah is publicized and monotheism and centralization of worship starts to be imposed. And John is active in precisely the kinds of remote places and geographically more fringe places where you might expect some of those traditions to persist, right? He's in Transjordan, right, where historically there were Israelites, but there are also lots of other people, and you could maintain traditions there maybe to an extent that you couldn't if you were actually living in Jerusalem, right? You couldn't be openly worshiping Baal, let's say, or something like that. We have, Yoruba, right, which seems to be Yah the Great, right, and Yoshimi, right, Yah of Heaven, and things like that. And so that's fascinating. And so I think that what might have happened is that, on the one hand, you asked about Torah and Torah observance, and I think that John, sort of challenging sacrifice, doing other things, may have been perceived as at least recognizing the humanness of Torah, right? That the Jewish scriptures don't just give you on a platter, here's what God's will is, right? And you just observe it and you're fine, right? That some things are in tension with other things, right? And you actually have to read it as a text that points beyond itself. And if John was saying that when others might, have refrained from saying those kinds of things as directly, a group that had a sort of a critical view of the Torah as something that had been imposed on them, kind of secretly maintaining these traditions, right, in pockets of places, might have started to connect themselves with him, right, listen to what he said more. And while he may not have been a Gnostic, right, it may be that it's within sort of the circle of his influence that Gnosticism takes shape and takes those pre-exilic Israelite traditions and John's baptism and maybe some of the mysticism that he may have taught and things like that, and brings them together into what we encounter as Gnosticism, really starting to appear in public soon after John the Baptist.
Kind of like you brought this to my attention, Enoch, where obviously one Enoch wants to find a patriarch that's prior to Moses, that's pre-Diluvian, and notice they don't really emphasize Moses at all. Like they're like, scratch the whole law-giving kind of idea. It seems more universalistic as well, rather than it being exclusive about this group of Jews. It's like, hey, animal apocalypse, baby. Everybody's going to become, part of the calf here, the white calf at the end or whatever. That was one thing that came to mind. And then the Pseudo-Clementine literature, even though it's later, 4th century, I think, it's funny to watch this Peter versus Paul thing happen, almost like this Jesus versus John the Baptist thing kind of might be another riff that they're trying to make. Great question is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. And I think, it was interesting that you mentioned early on, the fact that, you start being skeptical unless you're going to, as is appropriate, especially, if you come from a conservative background in which you trust everything that's in there, the obvious place to go next is to distrust everything, right? And analyze it and question it and say, I'm going to hold this to a really high standard of evidence. But then you see the little fossil poking through that says, okay, so this I'd have to really force this, into a predetermined mold of my own making in order to say that there isn't a glimmer of history behind the myth here, and things like that. And once you're starting to move back towards a more balanced position, of the kind of position that's adopted in mainstream history, right, which is, historians are all over the place, all over the map, in between the extremes, but historians, as historians, are not saying, yeah, this source gets everything right without it's inerrant and infallible, and and they never close off, the possibility that behind even some of these, really late things, say, well, we can't, we're just not sure, right? We don't say this must be myth because it's so late, and so, there could be a hint of something behind it, and some future evidence might turn something up. And so once you get somewhere into that middle ground, then you realize that, even later things like, the pseudo-Clementines and stuff like that, may have ripples of historical impact, right? That some of the things it says about Simon, about John the Baptist, just like the Mandaean sources and the Nag Hammadi sources, right? And because we have
Peter and Paul, yeah,
right,
because they bash,
right, yeah. And you'll sometimes get, one of my criticisms of mythicism is that it's like, they'll say, well, we have to go with our earliest stuff, which is Paul, right? Which is a good point in principle. But Paul is writing these occasional letters to communities that clearly have heard of Jesus before, right? And so clearly there are stories about Jesus, right? And if all you had was what Paul says in his letters, you would have so many questions, right? I mean, it's like, who is this guy, right? What salvation? What crucifixion? What. And so clearly he's assuming some sort of knowledge. And we can't just assume that everything that shows up in the later gospel tradition is, what Paul was assuming that people knew. But when you start trying to say, well, anything that's not mentioned by Paul, must be invented later, that just doesn't work, partly because of the type of literature we're dealing with, partly because of the kinds of things Paul says. And we realize that, stuff that's later, it's you really do need to analyze it. You need to be skeptical, but it's appropriate to ask, all other things being equal, could there be something here that's useful to historians in some way?
I kind of use this. I think it's a common sense method today, and I'm going to get to our super chats here in just a moment. But this is an important part to really dwell on, I think, because for so long it was like, what does Paul say? And if Paul doesn't say it, it doesn't matter anymore. Like, it has to be Paul or it's nothing. And so because there's this kind of assumption here that Paul is writing, you start with a celestial Christ, which in a sense, he does have this connection with an apotheosis, an ascended Christ. So you're already starting on this ground where it's like mythicism adds up in the mind of people, right? He's a heavenly Christ. He's already talking to this guy who's in heaven, who's to say he wasn't always in heaven? Philippians, see, he was there before. He comes down to what? Earth or some celestial realm, if you're a mythicist. Anyway, like, you see how the mind goes, and then they don't grant the Gospels. And this is something that as a skeptic, I backed up and started to allow that evidence to be something granted. Not saying I can prove it. It just makes more sense to me. When we talked about crucifixion, I thought about Philo. I thought about Josephus. I thought about other literature. I've thought about non-Christian sources, non-Jewish sources that talk about crucifixion. And Paul says he was crucified. Oh, okay. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with seeing archons or demons, angels, whatever, being in control of humans. I mean, even one of the Gospels says Satan entered Judas to do the bidding. It wasn't either or, it was both. So I'm like, okay, there's humans controlled by demons, according to Paul, it seems, or at least the demons are controlling the world and whatnot. Ephesians might even hint at this. Anyway, one more point. He says, James, the brother of the Lord, right? This is a huge debate. There are even non-mythicists who think this might just be a baptized believer in the community in some way as a possibility. That's not the most common understanding. That's just one that is kind of a valid possibility. But when I get to the first gospel of Mark, which is like you're not supposed to go there. When I was mythicist, you're not really supposed to accept what it's saying because that's euhemerism. It's making Jesus an earthly figure at this point. It, like, out the gate, has Jesus have a brother named James? And I consider that 70, 80, or 90 AD. I'll just grant somewhere in the 20 years after the war. I'm just saying it might be earlier, it might be later. And it's like an early witness of someone saying, here, he has a brother named James. I don't have any reason to think that's ridiculous. It's not ridiculous. People have brothers, and that he might have a brother named James. That's my opinion. So
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just before you go to the super chat, just on that point, because I think, on the one hand, when you're trying, you have to really exert effort to try and drive a wedge between what Paul says and what our earliest gospel tradition says. That's when you need to ask, okay, well, why am I doing this, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just something inherent in historical method, right? It may be like, no, I really want Jesus to not be historical or something like that. I mean, the fact that Paul mentions, he met with, Cephas, Peter, and James, the brother of the Lord, right? If this is just a baptized believer, then it doesn't distinguish him. It's something that's distinctive of him in the context of other baptized believer, right? And so it seems like the kind of nickname that, again, it's like being the baptizer. If you're among the baptizers, then that's really not going to make you stand out, right? So James, the brother of the Lord, seems to mean in the sense that people had brothers, right?
Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna get Abel here. Abel Chavez, and I think Jesus could be Elijah, reincarnation, not John the Baptizer, because the apocalypse is coming because of him. Fire from heaven equals nukes. The world is fighting and in a war because of himself. Oh,
well, there you go. You've got some interesting people on your.
And here's another one. Abel says it's far-fetched, but perhaps reality is playing backwards from the holy text. In other words, the prophets or people are coming back in reincarnation.
Okay. Let me actually say something in relation to this. I'm sure it's not what Abel Chavez was hoping for, but one of the things that's really interesting, that turns up throughout is, you've got, not gonna pull on that thread, but you have John as Elijah, right? But then you have Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Well, John the Baptist, right? And Herod say, they thought John the Baptist has come back and things like that. Or maybe, one of the other prophets or things like that. And so why do you keep having people identified as other people in the Gospels, right? And so one interesting possibility, right? Another figure who's interesting to bring into the mix is Mani, right? From Manichaeism. And he started out in a Baptist sect. For a while, people actually speculated that might have been the Mandaeans, but it wasn't. It was the Elkosites. But again, a group that emphasized baptism, ritual immersion more than other Christians did, and had more of Judaism, I think, in some of their traditions. We don't know as much about them as we would have liked to. But he actually has this sort of experience, in sort of the context of immersion and encountering his sort of celestial doppelganger. Right? And Dale Allison has suggested that might be what the Son of Man was. And Jesus thought of the Son of Man as his sort of heavenly counterpart and things like that. And so was John's baptism actually, at least for, one of the things that some people hoped to get out of it, and one of the things that maybe his close followers, circle of followers sought, was, an identification with a celestial figure, right? And so there's some interesting stuff there. And one of the things that we're told about Simon, right, in Acts is that, he claimed to be essentially the incarnation of this divine power called Great, right? And I remember I shocked somebody right back when I was a student, right? I was still in a sort of evangelical context, but I was studying stuff and realizing that, I got asked some hard questions here and realizing some stuff that I was told didn't fit together. And one great thing about being in a context in which the Bible is supposed to be the ultimate authority is that if you're pretty sure the Bible doesn't say what you were told it says, then you've got a good reason to challenge what you're being told. So it got me off to a good start, even though I sort of burst beyond those circles in a lot of ways over time. But I remember shocking someone when I said that Simon Magus is the only person in Luke Acts who's depicted as God incarnate, or is claiming to be God incarnate. Not as God incarnate, but as claiming to be. Because Jesus isn't depicted that way, right? He's a human being empowered by the Spirit. Of course, that may be the sort of the root of the whole idea of incarnation. But the question of whether John taught something that would lead people to expect some sort of encounter, some sort of mystical experience, is also a really interesting question. So the question of reincarnation, incarnation, it's not entirely unrelated to things worth asking about John the Baptist.
Thank you, Abel, for showering us with super chats today and having fun, interesting super chat questions. I think he's funny sometimes. I'm like, I don't know what to make of some of it. ScholarVids has an interesting question. Josephus mentions nothing about the teachings of John the Baptist. Do you think he preached the coming of the kingdom of God as described in the Gospels?
Yeah, it's really interesting that the Gospel of Matthew really depicts, this continuity between Jesus and John, more so than the other Gospels do. I'm also going to be working on a conference paper, already started dabbling a little bit, for a conference in November on John the Baptist and Q, the Q source. But Matthew's Gospel summarizes John's message the same way that Jesus' message is summarized in the Synoptic Gospels, right? Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And so it's we don't have that kind of teaching attributed to John in other sources. What is interesting, though, is that there are some places where they seem to converge. So Mandaean and Christian sources converge on a few details, like that John emphasized social justice and economic justice. The challenge to the temple, right? The Mandaeans view, when the announcement comes that John is going to be born, right, there are celestial portents and things like that. And then it's like, it's bad news for the temple, right? There's, that's like, earthquake, earth-shattering news for the temple. This is going to be the downfall of the temple and Torah and things like that, now that John's baptism is here. So the kingdom of God, though, doesn't come up in either of those. And so that's a little bit harder to say. But kingdom of God is very much a Jewish concept, right? We get this idea, I think, in the Targumim, right? Those paraphrases of the Jewish scriptures. We get them elsewhere. And, it really does just reflect something that is much more broadly found, which is the idea of God as king, right? Kingdom of God is just sort of God's reign or God's rule being implemented. And the interesting question is, if it's God's kingdom, how does that get enacted? And just as you mentioned archons working through people and Satan working through people, the expectation was that God is going to kind of restore the Davidic king in order to bring in the kingdom of God. And so the question is, where did John see himself in that, right? Again, the possibility that it's the high priest and the king, in the coming kingdom or something like that. Two figures that are not necessarily, that have different roles, but are not necessarily really of different status per se, is an interesting one that deserves to be explored more than it has been.
Thank you so much. And good question from Josephus on that. I really appreciate that, ScholarVid. Matthew Pop, could Jesus have been crucified as a robber, not Messiah, for what he did to the moneylenders? Or could Jesus' disciples stole from the moneylenders to use for the poor or for funding a revolt?
There you go.
I know that they're lestai. What is the name of the Greek term? Lestai or something?
Yeah.
Josephus mentions a lot about these lestai, but isn't it also used by Celsus later to define Jesus as like a robber or something like this?
I'm trying to remember. Certainly Jesus is crucified between two people about whom that term is used. And again, whether those are, whether robber is the right word, often it's translated as bandits, right? And again, the question seems to be sort of leaning in a sort of a Robin Hood type of direction. And, the question of, certainly from the Magnificat to John the Baptist preaching about, social and economic justice, to things that Jesus says about, the last will be first, the first will be last. You do get this sort of reversal. Nothing explicitly attributes any kind of, robbing the rich to give to the poor to these figures. But let me turn it in a John the Baptist sort of direction in this way. So given that John emphasizes social and economic justice so much, right? So one of the things that I'm thinking may have inspired him to develop this baptism, because it's, we are so familiar with Christian baptism as a thing that the whole question of why would anyone first say, okay, immerse in water and have your sins forgiven? Like, why did anybody think you could do this, you should do this? How do you come up with the idea? And it may be that the immersions of the time had some kind of influence, but why do this, right? Why come up with an alternative to sacrifice? And I think social and economic justice may have been a concern, right? He may have been aware, right? As we also get in the message, the speech that's attributed to Stephen in the book of Acts, right? That God doesn't dwell in temples made of hands, right? It's basically like an idol you've made yourself here. And originally God gave a tabernacle, right? And the tabernacle could go where people were, right? Whereas for this, if you live far from the temple, then it's going to cost you a lot just to get there, right? And then you've got to be able to afford an animal in order to offer the sacrifice. And so there's this inequity of access to forgiveness, right? In this ritual of animal sacrifice. And it may be that concern was one of the ones that John was motivated by. But there are things about sharing belongings. There's nothing about robbing from the rich to give to the poor. And so if you come across something that actually might suggest there's some positive evidence for that, feel free to send it my way. But otherwise, it seems to be speculating unnecessarily, around this movement and adding an additional detail that we don't have in any of our sources, when I'm more focused on trying to make sense of the little information that we think might actually be there in the sources to work with.
Right. I'm with Bart Ehrman on this one when it comes to they put above him on his crucifix or cross the accusation, King of the Jews.
Yeah.
And so if this is, and I thought there was a really interesting argument, the way he approached this, to showing a historical kernel there, where here's Jesus constantly saying weird stuff that sounds, I don't mean as like weird. I mean, it's very strange to say this was invented, is my point.
Some of it's weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, but I mean, specifically like to the 12 disciples, you will be seated on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
First of all, he's talking to the 12.
Yeah.
Did he not factor in Judas? Was he not aware? Is this a real saying that goes back to the guy? And then it's strange that there's these weird stories where the mother comes up and she's like, can my 2 sons please be seated next to you in the kingdom? Like expecting a real earthly kingdom to come.
Yeah.
Now, the Gospels really change that stuff over time, and they start going, you are the kingdom, and they spiritualize it, which is all cool and fancy and whatnot, realized eschatology. But that seems to show me a historical kernel because it's embarrassing in the later tradition. And this is why I started to become what they call, and most scholars would go, a historicist. What is that? Yeah. But when you know about the debate between mythicists and historicists, you start to understand. Yeah. I started going, would they invent? I mean, whole cloth, you have this supposed celestial figure in Paul. Paul's very apocalyptic. Then you invent a historical guy who makes all of these claims that are blunders in the real historical sense, but then you spiritualize that over time. You're not going to create a fictional invention of a failure. Then to create it, it just became more obvious to me. We're talking about a guy with flesh and blood, most likely. I can't prove it. I can't go, here's the bone of Jesus. And, but I can give you really good reasons in the sayings and in what is being said to go, oh my gosh, this is felt apocalyptic expectation. Yeah. I wouldn't create a fiction to do that. That's just me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. Hallelujah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm inclined to agree. And I think that, there's, another interesting question, the Mandaeans espouse nonviolence, which is interesting. And that may have just been a survival technique they developed in, the context that they were in or something like that, but not necessarily. And the question of John, Jesus, and violence is another interesting one. So on the one hand, I think there's some weight to John Dominic Crossan's argument that they would have clamped down harder on Jesus' followers and his movement as a whole if they perceived it as one that was really kind of, either armed people robbing from the wealthy, or staging a violent rebellion or something like that. Uh, yeah,
He says that pretty poetic. I like his Irish accent too when he does
yeah,
it. But he's
yeah,
right. He made a good point in Josephus where these accusations are nonviolent, but the way that Josephus's words were toward these nonviolent people was worse than it was the people who were violent. He was like, they were so persuasive in their communication that they saw it as a real problem. Whereas the violent ones, all right, they pulled out a sword. Rome would just come in and say, we're not playing games here.
yeah.
There's no question. Everybody has the sword. You can kill someone who raises a sword in revolt. Whereas with people who are communicating nonviolent kind of protest, they're a little more dangerous in a different way, according to the way that Josephus is handling them. And you're right. There would have been 12 crosses, or 13 if you count Jesus,
Yeah.
rather than it being just one guy. They figure cut the head off the snake, the movement will die. And Acts seems to imply this when it talks about Gamaliel saying, men of Israel, listen, don't fight these men. You might be fighting against God. Remember what happened to Theudas, and remember what happened to Judas the Galilean, and their movements went extinct because it wasn't from God. And I think it might be a wink from the author too to say Christianity's still alive, therefore that means it's from God. It's an apologetic in a way.
Yeah.
But it's cool.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, on the other hand, I think that Jesus really did think he's going to reign, right? Because if his apostles are sitting on 12 thrones, then where's he, right? Presumably, a big throne, above them or in the midst of them or something like that. And so there's really no feasible way that he is elevating them to a status above himself. John, on the other hand, he elevates above himself and says, no greater person, born of women. And
that's
I think
a problem.
Yeah.
He says, born of women.
Yeah.
No one is greater than John the Baptist. Yeah. Hold on, Jesus. You're supposed to be the man, right? And you were born of Mary, even if you want to say it's a virgin birth, doesn't matter. Yeah. That means John's greater than you. Whoopsie, we messed up here.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Jesus is an authentic figure who starts out, even if he's starting to think he might be that someone that John said is greater, he still has, one of the things that otherwise we don't get in the Jesus tradition, and we're puzzled by its absence, especially given what some of the things that Paul says about what Jesus was like, which is humility, right? Because Christians are so busy sort of praising him that his humility doesn't come through, and yet we have hints that it was there, right, in the historical figure. And so, this is a good example of it, like actually coming through in something that seems like it's got to be historical, because what Christian later is going to invent this?
That's what I was going to say. I apologize. I get excited. Your point is well put, because there's actually something to learn from this as a skeptic. And what I'm trying to get at is, this sounds historical, because Christians with high Christology would not have invented this. This would have gone back to a guy who would have said something like this. In fact, like, let's say I leave an impact historically. Let's just say, wow, Derek, you overcome addiction. You end up moving on into like becoming very popular. And one day you make an impact in this world where people are like, whoa. And even weird people might make little ritual cults, let's say, about me or something. Imagine that happened. All right. My father, though, you found me say something about my dad is the greatest man who's ever lived, greater than I ever will be. Okay. And next thing you know, I achieved things historically beyond what my dad did. But really, it just shows you that I honored and respected him so much. And as an authority figure, this sounds like Jesus is nodding the hat and saying, like any good, humble student would, that, hey, you know what? John is the man. John is the man. Hold him at high esteem. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. And so it helps us kind of maybe glean a historical kernel again. Here's that fossil possibly poking its head out. Skeptics are sweeping away. I think we should not throw it away. We should sweep it and consider it as a potential. So,
yeah, if when you're sifting, you find some little bits of stuff and you say, well, let's just throw those out too, because they're so small now. There must be, it's simpler just to throw the whole. It's like, no, the whole reason why you're sifting is, if there are some little tiny fragments, little nuggets of the historical tradition, you see those. There might not be many of them, right? And even if you find just one, right, then you've got a likely historical figure around whom so much mythology grew up that they're almost, imperceptible, or at the very least, we can't know about them because we don't trust any of it because it's just so over the top. I mean, the other one is that Jesus says that the law and the prophets were until John. It's interesting that there's a Hebrew version of the gospel that actually had about John, which is a slightly different slant on it, but maybe saying more or less the same thing anyway. Not until me, but until John, right? And even if Jesus is playing a role in this dawning of the kingdom, it's as part of this thing that starts with John, not with him, right? And so where Christianity has tended to view John as kind of the last of, almost like the last of the prophets, and then Jesus, what Jesus says actually makes him the start of the kingdom in a sense. The law and the prophets were up until this point, and then John is the turning point in history. And that too is one of those sayings where it's like, yeah, I don't think Jesus' followers are going to be the ones to invent this.
Wow. Oh
yeah.
Man.
If you ever hear sort of scholars of historical Jesus talk about the criterion of embarrassment, it's a terrible label. They came up with these criteria trying to come up with just some principles, just short, easy things to remember. And sometimes when you boil things down like that, they take a form that actually doesn't convey them very well, or doesn't starts to not look so good over time. But that really is just the point. They wouldn't make this up. Right. This runs, this runs counter to what they want to say. This runs counter to what they're emphasizing. That's all that thing they call the criterion of embarrassment is about. That this, it's embarrassing to have Jesus praise John above himself. And that's what that point is. And it's something that historians generally use. Right. They wouldn't make this up. Therefore, it's more likely that this was something that was actually being said at the time.
Makes me think of that Mark passage too, where Jesus says, I'm going to tear down this temple. He pretty much is saying, I'm going to tear down this temple. He's obviously got a temple protest here where they're like, that temple's got to come down. And John later makes such an interesting, if they didn't wink at you so hard, you wouldn't know what the heck is going on here. John has him talking to the people and he's like, hey, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And of course they're like, hey, he's talking about his body. Well, there's a problem. And I think they're trying to fix this earlier problem. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But at the same time, do you think if looking at it, historical methodology, which means we're kind of taking a naturalist approach rather than positing miraculous claims, do you think what made Christianity really sell is the fact that the temple actually did end up getting destroyed? And here is this cult, this little movement that actually is against the temple. So it's almost like flip a coin. Oh my gosh, it landed on the temple, actually gets destroyed. Wow. This actually gave them credibility, you think?
Yeah. And it may be that the only reason it's there in our sources, so consistently is because it was awkward. It was a liability, right? I will destroy this temple and rebuild it, and then he's dead, right? And what do we do with that, right? And of course, the fact that he's crucified and claiming, we're saying he's the Davidic Messiah, it's all, there's lots of awkward things, but that's one of them. And so we definitely get this sense of, this sort of damage control being done. Mark says that they were false witnesses, who were accusing him of saying that, or says they found 2 who agreed, and yet he says, and they said this, and he said, yet even so, their testimony didn't agree. There was something wrong. Don't trust them. You've heard that, he was accused of this, but don't trust them. Matthew turns it into, I am able to destroy this. And it's like, well, who would deny that Jesus was able to do it, right? And the fact that he didn't do it is not, by the time you get to John's gospel, it's made it destroy this temple. So you'll destroy my body. And then, and what's really interesting is that the Gospel of John acknowledges that in the temple, the temple building, when Jesus talked about the temple being destroyed and rebuilt, he did actually say something along those lines, and no one present would have ever imagined it was referring to anything other than the temple building that they were standing in, right? What the Gospel of John acknowledges, and that's actually, again, one of those things that's useful to historians, right? This author may be trying to reinterpret stuff, but can't just make everything go away that's inconvenient. And so you get these things coming through. And so in the process says, yeah, so at the time, nobody understood anything other. There's nothing about, nobody's prediction of resurrection, none of that. He's talking about the temple. And the interesting question is that Jesus, I will destroy this temple? Is that John, message from John, I will destroy this temple? Is this supposed to be a prophetic saying? So that's God saying, I will destroy this temple, right? Thus, the older prophets, from a bygone era might have said, thus says the Lord, I will destroy this temple and in 3 days we'll rebuild it. And if it has something that it can tell us about John the Baptist, then one of my questions is, what's the rebuilding? Is it building a new community or a new, and is John talking about a literal destruction of the temple, or is he saying, I'm going to give away forgiveness for free wherever there's flowing water, and you can say goodbye to the temple because its days are numbered, because there's a new day has arrived, and with that you get the question of how that relates to scripture, and it can resonate in all kinds of different directions, from a more conservative Jewish one to the Gnostic one. You get the setup for things that then, when the early Christians are trying to make sense of Jesus' death, they could actually, I think to some extent, plug him into some of that anti-temple rhetoric, and it helped them make sense of that, even though it was also awkward. Okay, so he's dead, the temple's still standing. What do we do now, folks?
Yeah, and I mean, these gospels are written after that, though, in my opinion. So it'd be, I could see how they would incorporate it as like kind of like, oh, you don't think this is the true Messiah? Look at what he said, right? We have sayings. They kind of spin it off into his death, and somehow that's tied into the fact that later on we have the temple's destruction. But if it's like when 9/11 happened, all this happened in 2001. There was a kid, I can't remember the kid's name, but he drew a plane flying into one of the towers. And next thing you know, we have it actually happen. Now, this kid didn't know anything about it, but they're in the sky. It's not like there haven't been planes that have crashed into buildings before in New York. But he drew it, and next thing you know, it happened. And there were people going, are you a prophet? Like there's interviews that are on the news, all this stuff. So I'm getting the point. If there was this movement that was not fans of the priesthood in this temple, that when it actually did get destroyed, and here we have these gospels so eloquently draw the Jesus tradition in such a way, it could have been like a badge, like, oh, look, like he was saying this temple needs to come down, and what happened? Look at what Rome did to this temple as some credential toward its validity, and it was selling in the Gentile community. Like, here is this real prophet, the Messiah came, and he had said some things. Of course, they had to do other things, jump around a lot of issues. I think cognitive dissonance could explain some of that. But either way, I just thought about that. I don't want to interrupt you. Did you have something you want to add to that?
Not at all. I mean, certainly people get things right at times. And when they do, and if they get them right spectacularly, people will remember that, and they won't remember all the times they got things wrong and things like that. It's the same thing. I think all of us do this, right? I mean, I remember talking with someone just recently about, they had the thought, some thought about, the possibility of an accident and being careful, and then sort of a bus, drives up on the sidewalk, sort of near where they are, and they're paying more attention and they're making connections. And of course, you have those thoughts probably on lots of days when nothing comes up on the sidewalk, but it doesn't stick in your mind, it doesn't make an impression. And then people get, not just, close encounters with, traffic, but, actually get in traffic accidents and didn't have any particular thought beforehand, as far as we know, right? And it's the ones where the connection, where things work out, that we remember. And so, when viewed with hindsight, that's how prophets often are defined.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to get into a few more of these. Then we got to start drawing to an end here. It's not going to be a day as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day, though. We're going to make sure that we can happen sometime within the next 2030. Jason Sobek says, would Jesus and John been like Manny had they lived?
Interesting. Quite possibly. I'm not sure if the one aspect of that is, to what extent does martyrdom, and having a shorter lifespan or shorter public activity actually sometimes help the new movement, and how much does having that person around to lead it for a long time help? And I think both models show that they can work, right? I mean, certainly, in Islam you have Muhammad, who is leading a community for a significant amount of time, and and it's still with us. Manichaeism almost was still with us, right? I mean, made it so close down to our time, and then sort of petered out there. Wow. So I'm not sure that one or the other necessarily helps, but presumably the religion these religious traditions would have looked at least a little bit different if things had unfolded differently. On the other hand, to the extent that there was prediction that Jesus would reign, if he hadn't been executed, and those who were so convinced by him sort of reinterpreting and finding ways of explaining how he could be reigning unseen and will come again and things like that, then I mean, if he just sort of died of old age, then I think that might have created a cognitive dissonance that would have been not something that no one could manage to find a way to explain, but I think it would not have carried the weight that it did when things unfolded as they did.
How often when we see someone die a tragic death, do they really leave a bigger mark? I think that plays a significant role in the way he died. May have changed the entire face of how we view this whole thing altogether. So Abel's back again. Thank you for the super chat, Abel. I combine reality and the texts and put 2 and 2 together. If the texts are trying to tell us something, then I believe reincarnation of certain people.
Okay. So, do you have any other questions, Darren?
Thank you, Abel. Durian Chili says, was Jesus a follower of John the Baptist? Then when John was beheaded by Herod, ruler of Galilee, did Jesus took over the movements?
Yeah. So I think that to a large extent that's what we encounter initially. That should be Herod, but I'm guessing we're gonna chalk that up to autocorrect. I've had Harold the King in some of my texts and things for a while too. I mean, I think that one possible way of interpreting both the focus on John the Baptist in some of our early sources is that they're depicting Jesus as the natural successor of John, right? The one who should lead that movement and take it into its next phase. There's this interesting convergence between Mandaean sources and the Gospels on another point, right? So there is this. There are parables and interesting things. There's even a good shepherd parable in the Mandaean Book of John, and interesting things like that. But there's this story about a soul fisher, like a figure who fishes for souls, and resonates very closely with some of the imagery Jesus used of the net, catching the fish, and things like that. But when we put that together with John's Gospel and the Synoptic Gospels, right? In John's Gospel, Jesus encounters some of his later followers in the circles of John's followers, right? As part of that movement. And if we take that and hold that in mind and then turn to the Synoptic Gospels, then when Jesus encounters these people along the Sea of Galilee, it's not for the first time. And you wouldn't get that from the Synoptic Gospels, but it may actually turn what we see there into something that's at least somewhat historically plausible, right? I mean, what we tend to end up with is Jesus is walking along and his halo is just glowing so brightly that they just can't help but follow him, right? Something like that. So he says, come follow me. And it's like, well, he's got the halo. Sure, we better go. It's a kind of scenario. Or he's just got this overwhelming charisma. But if he said, come, I will make you fishers of men, fishers of people, if that's basically, fishers of souls, fishers of human beings, soul, self is the same word in Hebrew and Aramaic. Was he using a phrase that John the Baptist used previously? And was he saying, come follow me? The thing that John started is not done, right? We're getting things going again, right? We scattered. John was arrested. We scattered, but we're not done. Then that paints that in a different light. And so I think that on the one hand, Jesus does take on that role, takes on the mantle of John the Baptist for at least a subset of his followers who make up the initial core of his group. which may just have sort of been John's group. Whether some left immediately and were like, yeah, no, this Jesus guy, we've never really thought he was our guy, or whether it takes longer for them to become disillusioned with him, it's hard to say. But I get the sense from the Mandaean sources that there may have been a while, there's this deep disillusionment with Jesus that suggests that maybe they did put their hope in him for a while. Or their precursors did at some point, right? And that left its impact on the tradition.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for that. Crossover Maniac, was there any mention of John the Baptist in the epistles? Remember, the Gospels are based on the epistles and not the other way around.
Yeah, and I'm not convinced that the Gospels are based on the epistles, right? They are, slightly later, but the exact order in which things were written doesn't always tell us the order in which sort of ideas came into expression, stories came to take a certain shape. There are places where we could just say, for instance, that Matthew is redacting Mark and editing something out of Mark. But one example is where Matthew drops Mark saying, thus Jesus declared all foods clean. And I think Matthew is just saying, yeah, no, that's something that Mark has introduced there, and that's not what that story means. And he's actually kind of reverting it to the way he's always heard it. And so the fact that Mark is earlier doesn't mean that, it means that all other things being equal, it's more likely to be closer to the historical reality. But sometimes the first person to write a story seriously tampers with it and tries to put a more positive spin on things, and then someone who comes along later lets something slip that actually is more to the point. So the order in which things were written is just one of the tools in the historian's arsenal to try and get at the truth, one of the principles that guides us, right? It's like, if more people say this, it's more likely to be true, unless, right? And then you've got the qualifiers, right? So there's some influence of the epistles, perhaps. We see Mark, there's some convergence with Paul, but Matthew seems not to like where Paul was taking things and seems to be wanting to argue for a different stance. But at any rate, we don't have John the Baptist mentioned explicitly in the epistles. There are echoes, though, of some of the things that we've been talking about today. They're actually having a chapter in a book on historical tradition in John. Actually, no, it's not that chapter. It's a different one. I've written several things on what John says about the temple tradition, and I'm trying to remember which one it's in. But Paul talks about, we have a sort of a temple not made with human hands, right? And whoever destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. And these sayings that seem to resonate with that saying that the Gospels are doing damage control about, that's attributed to Jesus. And so figuring out which came first, there are places where I think the simplest explanation of some of the things being in Paul's ethical teaching is that Jesus said those kinds of things, right? Not that Paul was the first person to come up with ethical teaching, and then later the Gospels come along and say, what are we going to do? This guy's got no ethical teaching. Well, let's just take Paul's stuff and attribute it to him. There may have been some of that, right? We do need to look for that, but I don't think that's the only thing that we've got going on, especially when Paul mentions, right? He says, not I, but the Lord says this about divorce. And it seems to be referring to what Jesus said about divorce, right? And so this is not me offering my opinion here. This is something that is there in the sort of the Jesus tradition. So, but no mention of John the Baptist explicitly, at least in the epistles. Hebrews mentions baptisms in the plural at one point, which is really intriguing, though.
Thank you, Crossover Maniac. Hit the like button, everybody, if you're enjoying this. We're going to wrap things up in a couple minutes here. Atheist Scriptures IG says, very late, so apologize if this has been covered. What do you think was the literary intent behind making John the Baptist's birth miraculous in Luke?
Oh, this could bring us back to something that we didn't get to talk about earlier, because I remember once I started talking about other sources outside of the Gospels and Josephus, mentioned the Mandaean sources, and we quickly sort of went on from there. But another interesting text is that work that's known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the Infancy Gospel of James. And right at the end of that, after doing a version of the miraculous birth of Jesus story, suddenly it says, and Elizabeth is fearing for her son's life, and she's, it's like they're in Bethlehem, it's like, is that where they're from? And then Herod is concerned and sending word to Zechariah because he's concerned that he's like, his son is going to become king. It's like, what the heck is going on here? And so there's a really interesting possibility that, again, I've been starting to revisit, that there was an infancy tradition about John the Baptist. And maybe that one even goes back earlier than infancy stories about Jesus. And so it may be that what Luke is doing there, given that we have a version of Zechariah, Elizabeth, that kind of stuff in the Mandine Book of John, it may be that Luke is taking something that people were saying, the kind of thing they were saying about John the Baptist, and weaving Jesus into it, and maybe even taking some of the stuff that originally applied to John and attributing it to Jesus in the process.
Thank you. He also comes back again. Verse John the Baptist, de-emphasis in Gospel of John, differences in Christology in Luke verse John, the proposed Gnostic influences on Gospel of John.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure that there's Gnostic influence per se, in the sense that for the Gospel of John, the God of Jesus is the creator of the world, right? And Gnosticism, its real defining feature is that the God of Genesis, who creates the world, is inferior to the supreme deity, right? And so, on the other hand, there are a lot of things. John was the most popular gospel for the Gnostics, and there were some things that they could, at the very least, work with. And I think one possible way of understanding the different Christologies in Luke and John, given that Luke and John are the two sort of gospels that really have the most interest in John the Baptist out of the four in the New Testament. On the one hand, right, the Gospel of John may be saying, okay, so John's followers are making him more and more into a almost a supernatural being, embodying this divine reality from another world, and so we've got to ramp that up on our end and say the same about Jesus. And Luke might actually be saying, yeah, that's, some of John's followers are doing that, and so going to emphasize that that's people like Simon Magus who are taking things off the rails. Jesus is this human being who's empowered by God's Spirit, and that's what you should be, sort of aspiring to, following in Jesus' footsteps, and as part of his movement, his followers undergoing his baptism. And so I think that the debates about who Jesus is and the different directions that Luke and John take things might reflect conversations that involve followers of John the Baptist as well.
Thank you so much. All right, just a couple more. No more super chats because I got to let them go. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, says Dr. M. David Litwa, his book Desiring Divinity made me realize an irony of the Bible. Jesus in Gospel of John textually is the biggest self-deifier next to Satan in the Bible.
Yeah. So talked about Jesus' humility, right? Coming through in a little snippet there. Jesus is not humble in the Gospel of John. Right. In fact, one of the things I show students sometimes when talking about the differences between the Gospels, right? Jesus talked a lot about the kingdom of God in the other Gospels, and not much in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, it's like 115 times, I want to say, more than 110 times that he says I, right? And I think that, on the one hand, this is, the Christians that produce that text saying what they want to say about Jesus by having Jesus say it about himself. But on the other hand, it does turn him into a figure who is, not humble, right? Is very much the opposite. And that, that's an interesting effect on things, right? Yeah. On the other hand, there's an emphasis on, the Son does nothing of himself. He only does what he sees his Father doing. And so even in that gospel, he's the Son. He's the agent of God, right? It's not as though he himself is divine. Those who don't accept his claims accuse him of making himself God, making himself equal to God. And the emphasis in the accusation is not that he has a status. If God appointed you to that, then you could have that status, right? He's making himself that. He's a self-aggrandizer. And the Gospel of John, even while it's aggrandizing Jesus and putting those words in his mouth, is trying to say, no, that's not true. And so when I first skimmed that super chat, I thought it said self-defeater. And there's a sense in which that's sort of what's, you've got it pulling in two directions. It's like,
right.
No, I don't make anything of myself, he says, as he talks about himself more in this gospel than in any other.
I'm actually pulling up something that I think is interesting. I asked you at the outset of our last interview that we did, if the New Testament taught that Jesus was, the Trinity was true. And I figure for this one, I'll just tease people with the intro so that everybody watching might take the opportunity to go and join the Patreon, of course, get a couple of books. We had fun with this one, but here we go. Let me hit play. And does the New Testament teach Trinitarianism?
No.
Answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Warning to those who are triggered easily because of heretical or scholarly ideas. You may not want to continue past this point. Jesus and God, are they the same? Are they equal? Anyway,
I put that in there. Is that whole thing in there?
What do you mean the whole thing? Like
it's a whole, is Tom Cruise in there? Is that the whole? Did you weave that into the actual video of our talk?
That's in our video. Yeah, wow. So I edited that in and I just put that at the beginning there, and I even slowed you down and had you going like,
I saw the New
Testament. Did you, you've seen this?
No, I saw that you did that. I just didn't know whether did you put that whole thing in the version that went live? That was because I hadn't seen that yet. So
this is not the version that yeah. We haven't made it public yet. So this is on the Patreon. Yeah. I love that how you're just like Trinitarianism. And I had to slow it down. Just no.
Love it.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want.
I love that movie too, by the way. A Few Good Men,
You want answers? I'm very much in the camp that you can handle the truth, and if you can't, the truth should still be told.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Abel, again for another super chat. The Halo means out of their mind reincarnation. Abel has a thing for reincarnation. I really do. Yeah. I appreciate the support, though. Abel is a good chap. He's constantly helping support the channel, and I can't make out a lot of the super chats that he does say, or I'm not able to connect those dots the way he's connecting them. But nonetheless, I do appreciate the support. Can I go ahead and plug your books here real fast as we're getting toward the end of all things here? The kingdom is nigh, so you may want to get a book or two because you can go past those angels that are guarding certain levels of heaven. If you show a certain book or two, you don't have to remember their names. They're all here in the text. So what is the latest publication that you have right now?
Yeah, so I definitely, for people who are interested in the topic I was talking about today, there is something about Doctor Who that came out slightly later than, and I don't even think it's on there. I don't know why. I think it's not as readily available in the States as in the UK. But where it's much more popular than the States, although it's popular here too. But what Jesus learned from women, right, is in a lot of ways this was a natural place to go, to John the Baptist. What Jesus learned from this man, right? So, but that's very much trying to ask questions that don't get asked about, influences on Jesus as a historical figure. Those kinds of questions don't get asked often enough by historians.
I love those questions, though. I've been learning a lot I've had a lot of female academics come on, and they're blowing my mind. The language we use and how they used it, how it's going to sound funny, but for those who are just now popping in and be like, whoa, I walked in at the wrong time. But the idea of piercing or penetration, there's always there's a lot behind feminizing or making masculine certain concepts in the culture. And one scholar, I think it was Celine, Dr. Celine, I can't remember her last name. She wrote a book called The Rape of Eve, but she talked about how the Roman Empire pierced enemies of the state by crucifying because they're penetrating them as a form of a kind of a domination, right? only women are supposed to be pierced. And so it's kind of a humiliating act on multiple levels. And I thought, if we just listen to some women for once, we might learn a thing.
Yeah, and that's something I emphasize in that book. It was so easy to have women be the huge, overwhelming majority of the bibliography on this. But that was also, sort of disheartening when I realized that that's because there's this long tradition of women writing about women in the New Testament, then being read by other women, and these points that were made by these female scholars, time and again, there were these insights there that in some of the major commentaries written by men, were just not there, right? And so it was great to be able to write this book and to say, it shouldn't just be women making the case for the importance of this and the influence of women on Jesus. It shouldn't just be women writing about women in the New Testament, because we, scholarship as a whole, right? Not just feminist scholarship, if you want to categorize things and pigeonhole things in certain ways,
right.
But scholarship, period, loses something when these questions are not asked, when feminist questions are not asked, when these voices are not heard. Yeah, and I think there I'm paraphrasing something. I think I actually quote Sarah Parks saying that, what we lose when we don't ask feminist questions.
I do want to mention Crossover Maniac said, sounds like someone imposing their modern views onto ancient people. And I don't know if that's what you were saying or I was saying, but I do want to emphasize something important in light of this. And I hope everybody gets your book. I'm leaving your book up so people understand while I'm saying this. Go get the book now. I actually have it all in the recommended Myth Vision book reading list. But I want to say something in light of, if someone wants to say biblically, oh, this sounds like you're putting ideas there that weren't there. My buddy Stephen Nelson, who's a Greek guy, he mentioned how women, their idea in the ancient world where women lost their virginity when they were pierced by the male phallus. The men lost theirs in battle when they were pierced during war in Greek ideas. So there's something about phallus masculinity and patriarchal systems, things like that. And I would like to just say that to say not everything is technically a modern political point, but I think it's worth emphasizing because we're really missing the way things were in the ancient world.
Yeah,
I didn't know if you were going to comment on that.
Yeah, I think so. There's there are lots of risks in going into a topic like this, because there is a risk of that you're going to be asking questions that are prompted by your own context, and that will determine answers that are not historically plausible and things like that. But the truth is that as I was working on this book, I had that very much in mind. I was concerned to avoid those pitfalls, and the two real pitfalls are that either we say, oh, they were terribly patriarchal, thank goodness we're so much better, and we don't realize that actually there are degrees of patriarchality, right? And women who were wealthy, had a certain amount of freedom that other women may not have had in a rural context, in an agrarian context. And so there were differences then, there are differences now.
Right.
Not everything is the same. And we're still human. And asking about the influence of women has never been inappropriate. It is to our shame that this thing that is an obvious thing to ask, right? Because even people who are male chauvinists have been influenced by women in some ways, maybe more ways than they'll admit, but they have been influenced. And so these are not just modern questions, and they're questions that we should be ashamed not to have asked as directly and as often as they deserve to be.
Thank you. I posted the link. It's also in the recommended list down in the description of this video. If you're watching this later, go to patheos.com, join his blog so you can stay up to date on any updates that he has in terms of articles that he's publishing. And you can stay connected to Dr. McGrath that way. Highly recommend you do that. Consider joining the Patreon, if not at the very least, to come watch that You Can't Handle the Truth video.
Yeah.
And, you are supporting the community, keeping me alive in terms of doing what we're doing today. And don't forget to sign up for Bart Ehrman's Gospel course. There's an early bird special now. Get it while it lasts. Any final words, positive, wise, inspiring, encouraging, anything that you'd like to say to our audience before we go?
No. That's what I said in the other video. That's what I'll say in this one. Yeah. Well, nothing wise, nothing insightful, but just I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
If I could say something wise,
Go
never
ahead.
forget, we are Myth Vision.